Good afternoon, good evening, or even good morning. I would like to welcome you all to the third and final day of our symposium, Future Bodies from a Recent Past, Sculpture, Technology, and the Body since the 1950s. My name is Franziska Lienhardt, and I'm a research associate at Museum Brandhorst in Munich, and I'm co-organizing the symposium together with my colleague Patricia Danda. The symposium is held in cooperation with the Study Center of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte in Munich. Our symposium takes place in the run-up to a major exhibition of the same title, which will open at Museum Brandhorst in early summer 2022. And in this major research and exhibition project, we're tackling the reciprocal influences of technological developments and changing notions of the body on the medium of sculpture. And I'm really happy and very grateful that so many speakers and thinkers are joining us today to discuss different aspects of future bodies from a recent past. And I wish you and us all a fruitful and hopefully very inspiring event and discussion. And thank you so much for following the symposium also online today. In the past few days, we had already heard a number of exciting contributions and interesting discussions, starting with artists of the long decade after the Second World War, namely David Smith, Namiko Konimoto, and Atsuko Tanaka and Edoardo Palozzi. And we also talked about the diverse corporeal, political, and material battles of the 1960s and 1970s with artists such as Jan Haworth, Alina Shaposhnikov, or Lucas Samaras. And finally, we discussed different theories of sculpture in view of technological change, in particular in mass reproduction. And that is why I'm all the more pleased that we are dedicating this panel with Materializing Cyberbodies to the future bodies of the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, Apple's first Macintosh computer hits the market, and in the early 1990s, the internet is released for commercial use and work outside the US military. With this, the hype of the hetero, or even no-topia, of cyberspace began. This decentralized place stood for the fascinating but invisible flow of digital data through the network of interconnected computers or devices. At the same time, it has often been described as a space in which all material and corporeal matter seems to dissolve in simulation. But what does it mean for the sculpture or even the art in general of the time when the body and the physical seemingly no longer play a role? Is there a possibility to enflesh or to materialize the virtual space? And at the same time, some perceive the body as a bad invention that needed to be redesigned, re-engineered, and optimized. Bodily boundaries were pushed by prosthetic augmentations and biotechnological modification and mutations, also towards non-human artifacts and species. In 1985, in her famous and to this day much quoted manifesto, Donna Haraway stated that we all are cyborgs, that is, cybernetic organisms, and marked an ontological shift in the definition of being human. And I think we have heard that already yesterday. In Haraway's work, the human appears as a hybrid being that has always already been made up of human and technological components. The cyborg also seeks to overcome the dichotomies of organic and synthetic, of inside and outside, or even of gender and race. And alongside Haraway, many scholars, artists, and theorists of that time questions the social and political narratives of body, technology, and identity. On the one hand, they embraced the utopia of the body as an open, flexible structure of meaning that can be rewritten and quantified. But on the other hand, they also reshaped the understanding of the perceiving body as an effective and vulnerable one. And against this background, this panel, consisting of two presentations, will first look at artists like Tixin Su and Julia Scher and their works of the late 1980s and 1990s. So in her contribution, Janine Tang will present how, through the use of different materials, the engagement with architecture, or the integration of objects and technological equipment, these artists investigated corporeal conditions and how these are shaped, recorded, and surveilled through modern technologies and societies of control. And in the second contribution, Marie-Louise Angerer will look back at a shift in the consideration of the body in the wake of technological developments and political circumstances in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. She will present how theorists and artists have engaged with the body and its imagery as mutable, virtual, and commodified form. She will also discuss which techno-utopias and dystopias have actually come to pass and how others have been replaced by new ways of thinking and body technology networks in the 21st century. And now it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce now Janine Tang, who's joining us from New York. Welcome. Janine Tang is an art historian and assistant professor of art history and visual studies at the New School in New York. Before joining the New School, she taught art and curatorial history at the graduate program of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. She has published widely in such venues as Art Forum, Art Journal, Journal of Visual Cultures, and Theory, Culture and Society, in addition to numerous exhibition catalogs and anthologies. She works on contemporary art, queer and trans aesthetics in visual culture, curatorial and exhibition history. And among many other projects, in 2018, with Lia Ganditano and Anne Butler, she co-curated the exhibition The Conditions of Being Art Pattern Gallery at the Hassel Museum in New York, for which she co-edited the accompanying book as well. Recently, she was awarded with the Annie Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for a forthcoming book, Living Legends, The Art and Care of Queer and Transgender History. Subjects of her forthcoming writing and teaching include art after the internet, contemporary ambient and sonic forms, land and climate change in Asia, and she researches on visual cultures of the British Penal Code in South and Southeast Asia. Furthermore, Janine Tang wrote a fascinating primary art historical analysis on artist Titian Su and his works and contexts at a high point in his exhibition history between New York and Cologne in the late 1980s. The essay appears in the catalog for Titian Su Liquid Circuit, an exhibition at Sculpture Center in New York that runs until January 25. Currently, Janine Tang is working on a book on art and profiling in the 1970s and a project on the artist Julia Scher's queer surveillance installations of the 1990s. And that's why it's all the more exciting that today we are already getting a bit of insight into her research. So in her contribution, Janine Tang will focus on Julia Scher, Titian Su, and other artists, and their sculptural and installation-based work during the late 1980s and 1990s. And we are very excited to hear more about the way they address the relationship between subjectivity, corporeality, and the informational selfhood in the then upcoming digital age and in the context of emerging theories of simulation and control. So please allow me to briefly quote from Janine's abstract for the symposium. Seen against advances in ergonomics, polymers, and personal computing, and recently available theories of embodiment and surveillance, pain and power, Titian Su and Julia Scher's art are examined here for the reconstructions of embodied experience in an age of control, end of quote. So Janine, thank you so much for being with us here today, and welcome. The digital screen is yours.
Francesca,
and we can.
You can't hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Francesca, for such a generous introduction. And thank you so much, you and Patricia, for the invitation to this symposium. I've been really enjoying hearing all the talks. And I'm really delighted to be here. And just also thank you, Katerina, Andrea, and Wolfie, and everyone at the museum for the extraordinary work that's been producing these events. I'm going to just acknowledge I have a small dog with a big voice, so she might jump into this post-human panel. Her timing is always impeccable. But to begin, I'd like to begin by focusing on art between 1988 and 1994 today by Titian Su and Julia Scher, as Francesca mentioned. who both worked between New York City and Cologne across multiple mediums. Sue in painting, sculpture, and installation, Cher in film, sculpture, installations, and net art. While they worked quite separately, they were both represented by Pattern Gallery in New York, and a number of pieces that I'm going to discuss today were initially shown there, and some of them are in that Sculpture Center exhibition that Francesca mentioned also for anyone who's tuning in from New York and who hasn't seen it. I'm going to propose that thinking across Sue and Cher's work indicates a couple of transitions. One, a reassessment of post-formalist process-based and video sculpture, and second, an emerging discourse of security that would reformulate disciplinary surveillance via electronic and digital control. Sue's wall-based works of the 1980s, such as Liquid Circuit, pictured here, often featured rectangular shapes and cubic volumes. They were made by applying lightly glossed acrylic and compound paint to wood panels. The edges were cut and sanded to produce the sort of notable rounded corners of his work. The works were scaled to walls, and their protrusions, such as the stack of aluminum grab bars here, suggest a kind of object to grip onto, or in Sue's words, an object coming out at you. And the surfaces had articulated sections of fine horizontal lines incised into a black surface, which produced a sense of topographic depth, echoing the horizontal scan lines and rolling screens of a flickering CRT television monitor. The surfaces of Sue's work were often also studded with rounded mounds and apertures, shapes drawn from battery dials, fish mouths, subway card readers, and ATM slots. The latter two were recently introduced into the East Village during its gentrification, when banks would target an artistic bohemia and its town collector class. The vibrant pop geometry of his work was initially aligned with some New York postmodern discourses of the 1980s, which were then turned simulationist, neoconceptual, and neogeometric art. And here's an example of one of these, Peter Halley's Two Cells with a Circulating Conduit from 1986. And in works such as these, Halley would describe his approach as a kind of simulationism, by which technical mediation would ostensibly replace the real thing. Air conditioning as a simulation of air, movies a simulation of reality, organic life simulated by biomechanical manipulation. And Halley would describe these motifs as not appropriated but hyper-realized. Like his peers, Sue was profoundly affected by Jean Baudrillard's simulations published in English in 1983, while also studying the writings of Elaine Scarry on The Body and Pain, 1985, Jean Baudrillard and Derrida. By 1986, Sue would state that, quote, the signifier is freed from the conventional signified. This ambiguity, which deconstruction attempts to explore, may not leave us empty, but instead gives us potential. Sue's art was initially seen to embrace and allegorize a free flow of signification. Preliminary sketches for such amoebic shapes as those pictured here would show their edges and perimeters dissolving into negative space, and Holland Cotter, reviewing Sue's 1987 show, would observe the float-like platform of ooze pictured in the foreground. Sue's wall and floor works were often displayed together, as you can see here, with the neon blue, a kind of unifying element, with works also being open to installation at different heights. And so his art would appear visually buoyant or contingent, phenomenally simulating a continuous and fluctuating virtual space. That said, these simulations were never disembodied celebrations of semiotic drift, but also deeply corporeal projects. In works such as Institutional Body, Sue would disrupt the flatness of the screen space that he created by fixing panels and objects of obdurate materiality onto an illusionistic surface. The textured and thick pink plane visually grounds, to borrow Sue's words, a screen to a physical world, and his palettes after 1987 were increasingly reminiscent of human and animal skin. Sue was driven by the question of how to contain a sense of an object that was not a painting as window to the world. He would propose instead that, quote, objects are themselves portals into virtual worlds, end quote. And so between wall and floor, spectators would apprehend screen space as an object, a portal, and a surround, amidst a widespread televisual and computational restructuring of outdoor, domestic, and workspace, with a concurrent reconceptualization of body sensation and experience. Like his peers, Sue came of age with electronic media such as television in the home and was an early adopter of computational technology. As Francesca just brought up, the mid-1980s also saw shifts in industrial and product design towards more ergonomic, minimal, and user-friendly aesthetics, registered in the release of Apple's first computer that was a personal computer in 1984, the Macintosh. Its monitors, windows, and dialog boxes featured thin grooves, curved contours, and rounded edges. These curvilinear forms were already ubiquitous in public signage, furniture, and architecture in the US, but they were marshaled by Apple to evoke desirability and approachability in their personal computing and digital devices. Su would train in environmental design and architecture at MIT during such a rise in ergonomic design, and he was especially attuned to these developments. And during the 1980s, he also worked as a word processor, often isolated in front of a computer terminal in a separate room, where computational screen space produced optical and phenomenological experience in a way much more immersive when compared to the more ubiquitous 1990s desktop access. Su's technological reorganization of embodied visuality also emerged within debates on the return of the hand in contemporary art. In the early and mid-1980s, postmodern critics were often critical of simulationist drift, the prospect of a derealized subject of information, and the market-driven return to the supposed authenticity of individual expression. Fetishizing traces of the artist's hand in painting and sculpture seemed like a way to reassert connoisseurship, mastery, and genius. Even so, artists associated with reproducible media and postmodernisms of resistance, such as Sherry Levine, would also begin re-emphasizing play and handmade work in their art. At this time, Su also adopted appropriation and post-formalist methods, including from artists such as Linda Benglis, whose process-based material experiments, structural engineering, and manipulation by hand were very influential for Su. In 1971, while a freshman at MIT, Su saw Benglis's ambitious and cantilevered pour works at the university's Hayden Gallery, some of which are pictured here. These works anthropomorphically touch the gallery walls and floor. They surge towards the viewer, in Benglis's words, quote, as a wave coming out into space. Their organic quality, their literal and phenomenal projection really stayed with Su during this period. And so in his 1987 works, he drew on the forms and methods by women artists such as Benglis. And I should also mention that at this time, between 86 and 88, the work of people like Benglis, Hesse, Louise Bourgeois were also reevaluated in solo surveys and group exhibitions such as Natural Forms and Forces, Abstract Sculpture in 1986 at the MIT List Visual Arts Center as well. And so Su's turn towards the body appears within a much larger return to visceral experience and organic form in sculpture. In 1988, David Joslet would also describe the work of Su, Robert Gober, and others as destabilizing and electronic and televisual every day. He would describe their sculptures as teeming with sexual politics marked by the AIDS epidemic. For Joslet, the critical vocabularies of these artists seemed acutely conscious, quote, of the desire we invest in the objects we acquire, end quote. He emphasized Su's techno-organicist use of tile, along with his stainless steel faucets and food pans built into his sculpture, and the way the artist thrusted, quote, the private into the public. He endows the laboratory-like spaces of the kitchen and bathroom with a voluptuous awareness of the body, of what goes into those domestic spaces to feed or cleanse it. And you can see why Joslet would make those kinds of arguments for works such as Autopsy and Double Bind pictured here. I also want to mark, however, that Su's references were not initially intended to signal a domestic setting, but rather a more medical one. While working in Cologne, he visited a medical library and appropriated signs and forms harvested from textbooks for such wall works as Automata in 1989, for which fleshy rolls of human skin are juxtaposed with orifices, fish mouths, and diseased body parts. Works by hand in pastel were photographed and then combined with reproductions of medical imagery and then printed as a single large dot matrix print. Lynn Cook would describe the affect of the Automata works as problematizing the, quote, complex and contradictory set of emotions surrounding the body viewed as patient, victim, specimen by way of ambiguous uses of machines that scan, clean, and store the body that might well torture it while also offering it opportunities for renewal. The prints that Su made were notably sized to ensure that the dots comprising the image are legible, so they elicit visceral sensation while also signaling the body's machinic reproducibility. Su would incorporate such imagery into his floor sculptures, binding chest x-rays into pink-toned tile, or in these works pictured here, pacemaker in intensive care, print onto glass, merging the specimen tray with the flesh that it carries. Unlike his peers who would ostensibly address the relationship between the body and technology, for instance, by depicting humans on new technologies, Su conceptually worked through the body as a kind of ontology. He wanted to make it fundamental to production throughout his sources, his surfaces, his materials, and his spectators. His sculptures of '89, such as Pacemaker, would fuse printed image with their containers and also incorporate handmade cement compounds in yellow, brown, and pink. Silicone was already commercially industrially available by this period, and since the 2000s, it's become Su's preferred material for production and restoration due to its simulation of flesh, its non-toxicity, and unlimited materiality. That said, during the 1990s and the late 1980s, it wasn't quite yet marketed to artists, even as Su's work sought to emulate the future surface that he would subsequently embrace. Su at this time was also reading heavily Foucault's work, especially Discipline and Punish, and so his sculptures also evoke the body's disciplining by architectural containment, scientific research, clinical presentation, and treatment, even as the medical body of the 1980s in reality was becoming coextensive with electronic prosthesis. In Virtual Flow, a straining eye is printed on a glass container. It's studded and bordered with fleshy appendages, hooked up to a monitor on wheels as though on life support or for visualization. Titles such as Pacemaker or Virtual Flow evoke the new electronic medical devices that would calibrate the rhythms and sustenance of those bodies housing and now increasingly depending on them. The 80s and 90s would see an increasing dependence of the medical body upon electronic technology, with automated external defibrillators available in 1985, smart infusion systems in 1992, with surgical systems and interior cameras gaining wider use at the turn of the 21st century. In Su's work, the body's ontology is something dependent on technology for its interior and for its sense of being. It appears as folds of skin and flesh extending into the television monitor, digital landscape, and built environment as a continuous surface. His endless grids evoke computer boards always punctuated with mounds, alluding to bodies becoming data at a time when financial and medical information was also increasingly transmitted computationally and networked. And so in Su's work of this period, the machines managing the body are technological medical ones, but also statist ones. In his fingerprint of 1989, a photocopy of the artist's fingerprints is overlaid with a grid and encased in a rubber-sealed frame manufactured in Germany. At the time, Su was working in Cologne, and immigrants to Germany were required to submit copies of their fingerprints and a certificate of good behavior from a German citizen in order to obtain residence. The exhibition in which fingerprint appeared was named Social Security, and its announcement card featured Su's actual Social Security number from the US, disseminating a measure of the artist's identification by the state to a random public. His long-standing focus on embodiment and technology at this time also signaled a broader transition from spatial discipline to digital control under the auspices of security. During the 1980s, many states began implementing machine-readable travel documents that included biometric information amidst fears regarding HIV transmission and racialized population change in the US. In 1989, Gary Marks would argue that DNA fingerprints might one day be our new ID card. In 1992, Gilles Deleuze's essay Postscripts on the Societies of Control was translated into English by October, and in this essay, Deleuze would emphasize a new phase of capitalism characterized by, quote, ultra-rapid forms of free-floating control, whose examples would include, quote, the extraordinary pharmaceutical productions, the molecular engineering, the genetic manipulations, in which what is important is no longer a signature or a number, but a code, or those numerical languages barring or providing our access to information. At this time, surveillance studies was introducing security as a new analytic, comprising government's mechanisms structured around an equilibrium that doesn't eradicate crime and punishment, but it manages and minimizes them through prediction and statistical analysis in service of a neoliberal order that would optimize the population and its social reproduction. But simply, the goal of security is not punishment, it is regulation. It is not to say, however, that security at this time was an altogether new concept. David Lyon has argued via Foucault that security has long existed from the need to protect citadels into contemporary machinic and liquid forms of wresting order from chaos. Whether by armed guards or software, security is ultimately patterned by a protective motif and an impossible guarantee of, quote, watching to care for, end quote. By 87, those available methods of watching to care expanded in space and scale. Marx would observe that, quote, video and audio surveillance, once restricted to high security areas, are increasingly found throughout work settings. He cites telecommuting practices that increasingly would blur the separation and surveillance of work and domestic space, as monitors, terminals, messaging, and productivity would extend security's penalties and rewards from the office and into the home. At the same time, sculpture incorporating television monitors, live and recorded feed would also increasingly enter major institutions. In 1994, the exhibition Thresholds and Enclosure, Television and Sculpture was mounted at SF MoMA, including work by Julia Scher, while the Whitney Museum reassessed the legendary 1969 exhibition TV as a Creative Medium and its television for the gallery across modified equipment, viewing booths, kinetic sculpture, and performative wearables. A video stressing the inventions wrought upon objects was previously critiqued by Benjamin Buchloh as gadget video, in favor instead for an art critically and pedagogically engaged with broadcast. By 1994, artists such as Julia Scher would work in both spaces to also rewire monitor sculpture's capacity since the 60s for interrogating surveillance in addition to a new discourse of security. Julia Scher, as New York City's first female C-class security equipment installer, operated the company Safe and Secure Productions, selling security equipment to women while bringing industry gear and nascent cybersecurity concerns to her art. During the early 90s, Scher made first-generation net art, including a cyber dungeon, and sold merch or shareware online, while also making sculptures for the gallery and for museums, which I'll focus on a few here. In Architectural Vagina, presented at Pattern Gallery in 1991, a security camera with a large lens, identical to those used by the FBI, is seductively camouflaged by red fronds arranged in a genital V. Mounted to a pillar at the top of the staircase leading to Pat Hearn's second-floor office, a viewer or visitor would ostensibly ascend to the sculpture's gaze. Yet the cables aren't connected. At times, Scher's apparatus, like Sue's surfaces, often operate as a kind of trompe l'oeil, requiring viewers to continually discern the difference between covert observation as a technical reality and as a simulation. Scher's sculptures often incorporate multiple cameras and lenses. Her playback devices typically mix closed-circuit feed and recording. She also often blends fictional chase scenes and live gallery footage, eliciting your concerned observation and your self-conscious comportment, training spectators in security's watchful claims to care, as its subjects and objects spread across space and time. In 1994, Scher began a series of surveillance beds, where monitors are mounted to each post depicting footage shot from within the gallery space. Cameras are trained at spectators entering the gallery and people reclining on the bed. The first bed was conceived for an older couple's private home, intended to join a domestic ensemble featuring John Miller's scatological impasto sculptures and Nayland Blake's SM table. Scher initially hoped her sculpture would help construct an intergenerational BDSM scene. Now in galleries, the beds may be circled but remain usable for play should viewers open themselves to being watched as gallery visitors on surveillance TV. The beds are custom-built, with black steel posts at each corner, four-sided spikes symbolizing life, and floral bed sheets suggest childhood innocence in need of parental care or a little's protection by their dominant. The surveillance beds share affinity with typical bondage beds produced in dark metal, bedposts and overhead canopies that would enable rigging and tethering. Scher herself often leaves floggers or other kinds of equipment for impact or restraint on the bed. She suspended recording microphones from above, and since the 2000s, also introduced handheld cameras. Scher typically endeavors to supply her viewers, or should I say participants, with the good stuff, quality gear for actual use. Which is to say, the surveillance beds are not only elusive of play, but enticements to it. Appearing in public spaces of galleries or museums, they are interpersonal fetish objects in aesthetic and sexual respects. The beds also appear 20 years after Mary Kelly's discourse on female fetishism, in which women might not only be objects of the gaze, but its very subjects as well. A key aspect of the surveillance beds are the observation of the self and others for protection and play. They cultivate a double scopophilia in which the pleasure of kinky looking meets that of remote observation. Share's monitors are always angled to be observable from a reclined position. The beds are not only objects to look at, but a place from which your watching happens. The genealogy from which they issue includes expanded cinema and experimental film. They ask fundamental questions regarding what cinema can be, what does it mean to watch, and whether a spectator could lie in bed and ostensibly watch themselves. And so the surveillance beds are sculpture as they are platform, a furniture and a cinema for training the observation of the self and others, and perhaps an observation for the self and for others. In Share's works, the monitors are never specific objects, but elements continuous within a landscape. Sculptures are frequently installed proximate to audio and performance works, in which a viewer's consent to give away information or to cross a threshold is persistently requested. Her bed sculptures are also arenas for decision, whether to jump in by yourself or with another. Do you perform? Do you voyeur, curl up comfortably, or abscond with the apparatus, which sometimes Share will permit in a burlesque of post-minimal sculptural gallery giveaways. By the 1990s, control itself notably functioned by way of enticement and reward as subjects surrendered privacy for access. And so these sculptures are not things intend, but perhaps arenas in which to grapple with what Marx called in 1985 a maximum security society, in which computer records dominate, where environments engineer decision-making, where demands for transparency risk your individual data, and where behavior is predictive, with every individual monitoring and somewhat suspicious. Sue sculpted a society in which bodies are continually folded into electronic and digital information as an ontological condition of being with no clear beginning or end. Share reminds us that although we don't choose this ontology and are thrown into it, our every move remains a threshold within a serial succession of security imposed and improvised, something we learn to sense and interpret. Sculpture on the cusp of the 1990s, for Sue and Share, I wager, offers ways of inhabiting being subject to security, its flows and negotiations enacted over and over against the proper name of who we will have been. Thank you all for listening. I'm really looking forward to Merle Louis Sangara's talk next, and back to you, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Janine. That was so impressive. What an impressive contribution in the practices of Tish Sue and Julia Share and others. And I'm really looking forward to our subsequent discussion. And I now allow myself to introduce to you Marie-Louise Angerer, who will present her contribution with the title Body Objects Revised from Cyborg Enhancement to Sensitive Entanglement. Marie-Louise Angerer is Professor of Media Studies and European Media Studies, which is a joint program of the University of Potsdam and the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam. She is acting director of the Brandenburg Center of Media Studies and the spokesperson of the graduate program Sensing the Knowledge of Sensitive Media. Before that, she was a guest professor at the University of Arts in Berlin and at the Central European University in Budapest. She was also professor of media and gender studies at the Ruhr University in Bochum, and from 2000 to 2015, professor of media and cultural studies and gender studies at the Art Academy of Media in Cologne. Her current research focuses on a definition of an effective digital non-consciousness and the restructuring of society through sensor technologies. Since the 1990s, Marie-Louise Angerer has published widely in the fields of gender, new technology, feminist and cultural studies, and in the field of what she calls the dispositives of affect, and she was one of the first scholars to bring the field of affect and affective studies to Germany in the early 2000s. Her most recent publications include Feminist Speculations, Genealogies, Narratives, and Temporalities, and this is my own translation of the German title, together with Naomi Gramlich in 2020, then Ecology of Affect, Intensive Milieus and Contingent Encounters in 2017, or Desire After Effect, whose original German version she already published in 2007. Plus, Marie-Louise Angerer published and authored numerous articles and in books and journals. Moreover, Marie-Louise has just recently written a brilliant essay for the catalogue that will be published in the course of the upcoming exhibition Alexandra Birken A to Z, which hopefully will be on view at Museum Brandhorst from May 27 this year and is curated by our fabulous colleague Monika Bayer-Wermuth. And to follow up with a funny coincidence, in 2002, Marie-Louise Angerer, together with Katrin Peters and Zoe Soufoulis, published the anthology Future Bodies on the visualization of bodies in science and fiction, which explores notions of bodies in science fiction, posthuman subjects, and interchangeable gender, and asks about the bodies we are not yet but have always been. And the name, cousin, and contents of this publication are, of course, not to be overlooked in our project on the future bodies from a recent past. And that's why it's all the more exciting that with her contribution to the symposium, Marie-Louise Angerer will look back at artistic and theoretical practices of the 1980s and 1990s with a focus on feminist treatises on the technological body, and will examine from a contemporary perspective what has changed since then. So please allow me to briefly quote from her abstract. The last 2 decades of the 20th century were dominated by extensive discussions focusing on the body. Post-structuralist body debates, such as Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter or Lan's spectacular body operation performances, Stelag's body enhancement actions with a third techno-ear, cyberfeminist viral bodies fighting the brainworm in the net, transhumanist visions of the body as technologically upgradable. At the beginning of the 21st century, the definition of the body turned towards a general understanding of its material entanglement and material responsibility for the world humans and non-humans live in and with. End of quote. So I'm happy to pass on to her and to her presentation. Dear Marie-Louise Angerer, thank you for being here with us today, and welcome. The digital stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Franziska, for this really very, very friendly introduction to my person. And Janine, I would like to add, it's a real pleasure to discuss with you all after my talk, since I was very lucky to be for many years the colleague of Julia Scher at the Media Academy in Cologne. And it was very interesting to work with her, even sometimes. She was such a radical person, or she's such a radical person, that I was only, look at her, not what she's what wanted me to do or wanted me to understand it, but it was a real pleasure with her all the time. So thanks very much again. And I would like to also thank from my side to the fantastic team of the Museum Brandhorst and to this fantastic setting of to allow us to be together, even though we couldn't do this in presence. So thank you very much also to this technical support. I know, how complex it is and how the nerves are always, very, under tension. Okay, so my contribution, as Franziska already said, mark maybe a slight change compared to the lectures we have heard over the last 3 days. My own research over nearly 30 years now have always been focusing on the question, which are the forces in the sense of Foucault leading to changes in our perception and thinking of the human body, the technological environment and its non-human others? Which stories have started to redirect our being with the world towards an understanding of the body today as open, entangled, and dependent on its Umwelt, on its environment? The thinking of our body thus has not only been influenced by philosophy, medicine, and other scientific inventions and schools, but to great part by media technological development and shifts, and these shifts have been dramatically fast and globally encompassing in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. To demonstrate these shifts, let me start with 2 observations, pretty small at first sight. I would like to begin by picking out these 2 small moments that mark significant shifts in the discourse around the body as it emerged in the last third of the 20th century. Firstly, the dispute that broke out. So it will take a little while until I show my first slides, don't worry. Firstly, the dispute that broke out at the third feminist conference of women art historians in Vienna in 1968 over links between portrayals of violence and the lived reality of women, and over the status of fragmented images of the body in 20th century art. While the German art historian Renate Berger argued against distinguishing between image and reality, equating violence in picture with the violence done to women and their bodies outside pictures, the art historian Sigrid Schade advanced an opposing theory calling for the ideal of the whole intact body to be deconstructed as a myth of bourgeois notions of totality. By contrast, he argued the fragmentary was an indictment of this idealized patriarchal image of an intact body of the female that is found throughout 20th century art. A second significant shift in this vein took place 10 years later, when Feng Chia published his essay Mattering, a critical and comparative review of two recently published books, Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter in 1993 and Elizabeth Gross' Volatile Bodies in 1994. At the time, in 1996, it was considered unthinkable to read Lacan and Deleuze at the same time, and equally impossible to quote them concurrently. Back then, the camps were still rigorously divided, as signifying chains in Lacan and vanishing lines by Deleuze continued to operate on widely disparate planets. And yet Chea's dual approach marked an attempt to shed light on something quite specific, focusing on these two particular books as a means of outlining a significant issue. In Mattering, he compares Gross and Butler and their respective return to the body. He credits both authors with having a broad and comparable level of commitment to feminism and pays great respect to Butler for pursuing her critical path. That is, for her resumption of the Aristotelian schema, which she will define as the morphological imaginary in contrast to Lacan's imaginary morphology, as well as for her performative translation of speech act theory. Chia argues that these, taken together, constituted a profound critique of the West's omission of the body, and that they expose an idealistic understanding of a logos-oriented subject. And yet, this is where his main point emerges. Even if Butler's book represents a fundamental critique of Western humanism, it nevertheless ultimately remains devoted, especially in its Lacanian version of psychoanalysis, speech act theory, and form-matter distinction, to an inevitable anthropocentrism. Chia notes that Elizabeth Gross had long since overcome this devotion in Volatile Bodies, noting that, in traversing the different perspectives on Derrida, Foucault, etc., there are definitely moments where the post-human stand out more strongly than would ever be the case in Butler's work. The 1990s can be described without exaggeration as a decade in which discourse on the body became dominant and obsessive, as the discussions and theoretical camps oscillated, as already mentioned by Franziska, between its obsolescence in the work of the Australian artist Stellac, its endless masquerades in the performance of French artist Hollande, and its co-shaping by animals and machines in Donna Haraway's already mentioned Cyborg Manifesto. Inspired by Spinoza and Deleuze, bodies were defined as open, their limits as permeable and porous. Spinoza's claim that no one knows what a body can do, introduced into the debate by Deleuze, provided the cue for a performative turn, which finally, around the year 2000, was to give rise to a further, more comprehensive shift referred to as an umbrella term, the new material turn. My next section is titled From Gender to Body Trouble. With this turn or turns, not only had the bodies and body images become very different, but the definition of the body had also freed itself from its limits of the discussion essentialist versus deconstructivist, and entered into new connections. Technological components give rise to cyberbodies, and under the influence of the new material turn, concepts of the body were tested that defined the body as connected with and dependent on its surroundings. Haraway, Karen Barat, Lynn Margulis, Mira Hurd, only to name a few among the theorists focusing on environment, interaction, and diffraction. Diffraction as opposed to representation, which dominated the theoretical approaches up to the 90s, also in art discourses. In contrast to representation, diffraction is defined by Donna Haraway and taken up by Karen Barat, and it signifies not only a different narration, but diffraction addressing a physical phenomenon, and at the same time, a methodological approach insists on patterns of differences and thus enables the articulation of new relations between media technologies and humans with their non-human agency. Now let me go quickly through a few images as examples which demonstrate these steps. Just don't have to get my remote. Yes. This is the work, a part of a work of the Australian artist Patricia Piccinini, and it exemplifies these new body images that demonstrate the concept of open bodies, open to animals, viruses, and others. She's an artist to whom Donna Haraway has paid much attention, and this image is from the series Surrogate. And then sorry. Yeah. The work of the Hollande, while the French performance artist Hollande underwent stage surgery as a psychoanalytical study to show that there is no truth of any kind under the skin. The skin is instead deceiving. We don't have the skin, we are, as she quoted the Italian psychoanalyst Lemoine Lucioni at one point. And here is the quote very briefly: skin is deceiving. In life, one only has one skin. There is a bad exchange in human relations because one never is what one has. I have the skin of an angel, but I am a jackal. The skin of a crocodile, but I'm a poodle. The skin of a black person, but I'm white. The skin of a woman, but I'm a man. I never have the skin of what I am. I already mentioned, I don't know, this is a little bit with my remote control. Yeah. I'm sorry, it is just jumping by itself. Yeah. Stellac already mentioned the new bodies. The new bodies were playfully and sensually opened up, their surfaces expanded by means of technical elements and devices, such as in the work by the already mentioned Australian media artist Stellac, or as in the next example, another Australian artist, Melinda Rackham, a cyber artist prominently supported by the artist group Cyberfeminist, where you can see, not bodies any longer, but viruses, and other forms. And the last example in this row by the Canadian artist, by the Canadian artist Char Davis. It has its own Char Davis, Canadian artist, here seeds from Ephemere. It's a cave, an automatic virtual environment where you could just walk in. So these are the examples. But behind these provocative and playful body image presentations, however, it was becoming increasingly clear that a fundamental shift in approaches to thinking the body had begun, as well as bodies being subjected to an enhancement program taking to extremes in transhumanism. Nature and the environment, too, underwent more and more technical upgrades designed to facilitate new interactions between inside and outside, between data and control, human beings and prehensive machines, as a term coined by Luciana Parisi. Entangled visions. In early works by Wally Export and Dan Graham, something occurred that was typical of media art in the 1970s. Walking towards a mirror, few saw a reflection of themselves walking away, or they walk toward one mirror while being simultaneously reflected walking away from behind in another. In other words, one never met one's mirror image. This play with mirror images can be read as a metaphor for a school of thought, and in particular feminist thought, that was undergo a radical reversal in the 1990s. A first rupture of the representational order has happened. A politics of difference centered on sexual difference gave way to a politics of relations, and the relational that worked with a new concept of matter, a materiality, or rather materialities, conceived of neither as passive nor as autonomous others, but as co-actors in a process of worlding, as Donna Haraway puts it in When Species Meet. The science fiction film Annihilation. Moment, I have to get now the next picture. Yes. The science fiction movie Annihilation by Alex Garland, based on a novel with the same title by Jeff van der Meer, from the year 2018, is about an unknown zone, a terrain where unexplained things happen. A form of radiation known as the shimmer is ceaselessly spreading, and any living thing that comes into contact with it changes dramatically. Of all the troops sent into the shimmer to investigate, none have ever returned. Now, 5 explorers set off again to find out what the shimmer is. And one, I have to say, one, of course, female explorers. What it does, why, and how. In the film, the shimmer forms a threshold that is crossed without people immediately noticing this. The effects of the new zone come on gradually, disturbing, disconcerting, strange. The shimmer could be described as an empty mirror with the emphasis on emptiness, because as we learn over the course of the movie, the shimmer refracts not only light, but also the DNA of plants, animals, and people, meaning that if, as Lacan claims, the mirror reflects a distorted ideal self or self-image, then the shimmer denies any kind of image as representation, instead intervening in the morphology of the bodies that figure in the film as fantastic human-plant hybrids. You could see this in this still from the film. When Deleuze and Guattari wrote about becoming other, this becoming was localized in the phantasmatic, an imaginary becoming that shrouded the real body for moments, enabling it to become something else. In my view, however, Butler's call in the early 90s to understand the body not as a text, but as something that matters, marks a turning point whose implication and consequences are still shaping the ways we think today. Materiality, body, earth, elements, environments, they all intrude, is expressed by the Belgian philosopher Isabelle Stengers in her discussion of the intrusion of Gaia. And not only that, they actually get involved. As a parallel to this new perception, fiction intervenes in the terrain of facts, pushing the phantasmatic aspects further into the spotlight. With Haraway's work, if not before, stories have permeated history and shown that every matter, every body, and every automotion comes with a semantic surplus from which it cannot be detached. Since then, the semiotic material nodes, referred to by Haraway, have spun a dense narrative network that also includes these stories. The story told in Annihilation is the transformation of humanity into a geological power or into an objective phenomenon, into an object of nature, into a context or a conditioning environment, as the Brazilian anthropologists Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro have put it. Sent into Area X to investigate the changes to animals, plants, and environments caused by the shimmer, the explorers in Annihilation only perceive the extent of the alien milieu once they have abandoned their bodiless viewpoint and understand themselves as part of the field under study. That means only when they are willing to accept that they themselves completely and utterly belong to it, are part of it. Those who step into the shimmer are very soon no longer themselves. always already more than one. I come to my last short section. Images of the body are woven into a net of theory stories, embedded into technical infrastructures, shaped by epistemological transformations, once more highlighting the fact that the image of future bodies will emerge from an impure mixture. And neither medical view of the body has ever been an objective view, nor is subjective self-description reliable. Instead, every age invents its own stories, semi and science fiction, that are then occupied by corresponding images of the body in art and literature. The already mentioned book, Future Bodies, by Franziska in her introduction zur Visualisierung von Körpern in Science and Fiction, the visualization bodies in science and fiction, an anthology I co-edited with Katrin Peters and Zoe Sofolis in the beginning in 2002, includes an essay by the art historian Hanne Lorek entitled Körper, die ich nicht gewesen sein werde, Bodies I Will Not Have Been, in which she discusses allegorical configurations in the work of contemporary artists like Robert Mapplethorpe, Linda Benglis, Robert Gober, and Cindy Sherman. But today I would like to conclude my talk by rereading the title of her essay, 20 years later. The construction of the future perfect is a device famously used by French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, whose linguistic revision of the Freudian psychoanalysis makes a strict distinction between thinking and being, between mind and body. Today, however, bodies I will not have been can be read beyond the psychoanalytical dimension as a phase displacement between cognition and matter, between material and cognitive processes. Because as bodies have begun to expand, cognition has been redistributed itself in equal measure, a topic addressed by Catherine Hayles in her recent discussion of non-conscious cognition and whom we will hear tonight, which means that Hanne Lorek's title in The Future Perfect can be reread today in the sense of a drifting apart, with openings for new agents like machines, surveillance technologies, smart houses, sensitive environments, and many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marie-Louise Angerer, and thank you also, Janine Tang, for your inspiring and very insightful contributions. And I think your two talks complemented each other in a very interesting and also way, and also have some overlapping points that I'm now looking forward to in our discussion. But before we start, here's a quick information to our audience regarding the schedule. So we will first speak as a trio and then open our round to the other participants of the symposium. But I would also like to take questions from the virtual audience into our discussion. So you are much welcome to ask questions via the chat of our YouTube live stream. And now to our discussion. Because you talked so much about open bodies in your two contributions, and because we are also thinking a lot with open bodies or open concepts of sculpture in our project, Future Bodies from a Recent Past, in our following discussion, I would like to focus somewhat provocatively on the construct of boundaries. And by these, I mean both the boundaries of bodies and also boundaries between species and agents, but also the boundaries of a space or a system, and also the boundaries of the medium, and especially of the sculptural medium, if one can speak of such a thing in this time of the 1980s and 1990s. And maybe I'll start with the latter, with the medium specificity and its limits, and a question for you, Janine, because this is also very interesting for a young generation of artists, and I think Ursula Ströbele said that yesterday already. So how does this post-media narrative function at all in this period of the 1980s and 1990s? And perhaps you could describe this questioning of the overcoming of a traditional medium specificity, again, on the basis of the works you presented. And it would be maybe also fascinating to hear how, for example, do Shinsu or Yuya Share talk about their works? Do they define them as sculpture?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And also just thank you so much, Marie-Louise, for that wonderful talk. I'm really excited to be in more conversation with you around Julia, cyber power and culture. And there's so many interesting threads, I think even methodologically, that like there were like psychoanalytic as well as like electronic Deleuzian sort of like affect-based concepts that like came throughout. And that's maybe something I would also love to talk about down the line, following from your prompt, Francesca, on like boundaries, like the sort of analytics we even bring to bodies and sculptures. And to immediately address the medium issue, I think what's interesting to me is that both Tishan and Julia, they work across multiple mediums, so they never feel confined by like, I have to work in painting or I have to work in sculpture. They sort of like take the sort of materials and mediums that make sense for like the conceptual work that they want to do. And so I think there's a kind of conceptualism that we haven't really talked about, I think, so much in this conference so far, but a sort of like idea-driven approach to the materials that then get used, which is why you have someone like Julia doing like net art and sculpture and installation concurrently, so Tishan making like works for the wall, works for the floor, but also then wallpaper, and like also doing those concurrently. So you can't really extricate sculpture from working with other mediums. At the same time, it's a moment where like sculpture already has been redefined to be in that expanded field that people have talked about like yesterday and so on. At the same time, it was interesting to me that I think Julia might be hanging out in the YouTube channel. So Julia, you can just telegram me if like if I'm like misinterpreting or misinterpreting you. It's totally fine. It was interesting to me that like the beds are sculptures, but like predictive engineering is an installation, right? So there's a kind of separation that individual artists make between what is a sculpture and what is an installation. When if you compare two artists, you might be like, why is one a sculpture or an installation? This is something that's individually determined by people during this time. Something that's not necessarily a technological thing, but I've been reflecting on is that both Tishan and Julia make sculptures that are very mindful of how they are installed. And that feels like a very sort of 80s thing that's going on for people in the East Village. And I'm going to give you an example of Katie Noland. If people saw like the sort of installation at the MMK, for instance, you have like these big sculptures with like long steel poles, right? And they're kind of like almost like the length of a wall, and they should be installed in that way, and what happens is because of the shininess and reflectiveness, they sort of catch all the activity that's going on in the gallery. That's happening around them. For someone like Noland, she didn't want to necessarily think of like, oh, here is sculpture, and then you walk, and then that experience is not theorized to another sculpture, and then you have two different experiences with this negative space of untheorized aesthetic experience in between. So started making sculptures by which like what is the length of someone perambulating between different moments of sculpture would actually be acknowledged. And for people like Tishan and Julia, it's like there's a mindfulness of how you plop a sculptural object into space that really takes account the gallery, its placement, its positioning, if the viewer is going to come across a threshold, like there's a mindfulness around architectural space, which is not the same thing as like sculpture becoming architecture or in that sort of like diagrammatic relationship with architecture. So that for me is an interesting thing where people are still committed to mediums. At the same time, they're rethought relative to how they get shipped, how they get installed, how they get conserved, and how they get updated. Julia is a really interesting person in that regard. A lot of the updates to her work, end up with works that look very different from the original sort of first parent edition. Like predictive engineering at SF MoMA is a great example of that. Whereas like you have people like Tishan Su who will conserve their work with radically different materials, but to actually upgrade the aesthetic that he was hoping to get at a certain moment, but couldn't quite achieve. Like those works from the 80s that are done in like a cement compound, it's like silicon is a better material for him now. And so those updates to the work, will incorporate that. So there's a much more like temporally and spatially open version, a way of thinking about medium in almost like a versioning of the medium itself. And it's like location and space that's interesting for like the both of them, I think. But that's like one thought. I've been rambling on for a little while, so I'm gonna step back and check in if yeah.
That's perfectly fine. And maybe that brings me to the next question, because yesterday we talked already a bit about a certain use and effect of material and surfaces and how these have effective qualities. And for example, someone like Linda Benglis, you already mentioned, and other artists who were subsumed under the term of eccentric abstraction, and that you mentioned already with the natural form exhibition. But what about the 1980s and 90s? And I think you answered that in a way, like how does someone like Titian Su deal with this organic and also almost sterile material effects? So with, I don't know, material like vinyl, cement, or styrofoam, or even the ceramic tiles, or steel, like you mentioned before with Katie Noland, that perhaps affects differently. Maybe you can tell something about that as well.
Do you mind repeating just the last sentence that you said? Because I think my audio cut just.
So yes, I was wondering, what about the 1980s and 1990s, and how someone like Titian Su dealt with this organic and also almost sterile material effects, for example, in material like vinyl, cement, or styrofoam, or ceramic tiles, or stainless steel?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Because I think over time, I think it's really a project of Tishan's of really wanting to introduce embodiment as much as possible into every stage of the work. From your sources, from the materials, through the impact of his own hands on the material, to how you're going to feel as a spectator. So I think through the 80s and 90s, you see, and even into the 2000s, you see him trying to add more body as much as he can through every conceptual stage of production. And I just also want to mark that this puts him at odds in terms of the very grim sort of medical imagery he starts to use with the sort of prevailing work in his sort of East Village, Soho, downtown New York sort of milieu, because a lot of what object-based sculpture was really about the commodity, and so you see recent exhibitions Brand New at the Hirshhorn that really situate some of his early work with that sort of commodity aesthetic, and which he certainly did. But through the late 80s, that drive towards thinking about the sort of biomedical body becomes more and more pronounced. And then that's where you also see his reception start to wane, because he doesn't fit anywhere with those people. At the same time, it's a little bit too electronic, for exhibitions such as the natural forms. He wouldn't have been in that exhibition. So there's a funny way also in terms of the identity politics of the time too. As an Asian American man, you have Asian American artists who are received on the basis of the image. So a lot of critical postmodernisms, which I really find a lot of that work amazing, is really photo and lens based and image based, and is about depicting and disrupting the image of the body. But then when someone moves to something that is that abstract as Tishan, he falls out of that discourse too. So personally, I was hoping I could be able to make an essay around him and Byron Kim in the late 80s. Doesn't work. They're not crossing paths. Their work is so different, even though they're skin and a grid. So I think in terms of the work you're describing, it sort of falls out of what our prevailing discourses of imaging the body, but also sculpting and rendering the body. So he appears a little bit of an outlier, even though paradoxically he's still in actually a lot of very prominent social circles. David Jocelyn and Lynn Cook are writing about him. Rosemary Trockle writes, his certificate for good behavior so he can enter Cologne. So he's kind of in these circles, but he's also out of them at the same time for how you can think the body and the technology together, because of that very grim focus on the biomedical body, and also that focus on immigration, which I actually think of as a sort of way of thinking about race and the body that's not a sort of representative form. But if you think of state control, the history of medical experimentation around Asian, brown, and Black bodies, there's a history there for why someone might want to look at that kind of imagery and then make it intrinsic to the functioning and production of a sculpture. I'll stop there for a second.
Thank you. And you mentioned the influence of Elaine Scarry for Sue in your lecture. And in her publication, Body and Pain, she turns in the early 1980s against the post-structuralist and deconstructionist theories that questions the body that in the time, and they repositioned it or like the subject in the body again. And this body feels physical pain in a way. And here I would like to ask a question to you, Marie-Louise. And I know that there are big differences between affects on the one hand and emotions and feelings on the other, but what about the difference between affect and pain? And are there perhaps even like productive points of overlap between affect and pain? For example, if we consider the reacting body here.
Well, this is actually a very interesting and very good question. Thank you. Because if you started asking about borders in comparison to, or in contrast to open bodies, actually I would say, the pain, skin, pain, and affect are marking right the line between openness and closeness of the body. Brian Masumi is one of these famous affect theorists, and exactly in the same year, then Chea has his article on Butler and Gross, which I was quoting in 1996. Masumi says, this affect is always too fast to perceive and too slow, to get to that we can get it. So, it's just right, the moment when we feel pain, it's already too late and it's still too early. So we never are with affect. It's the presence of pain. It's this now of pain we can't get. And this is more or less, an interesting equation between a definition of affect as this moment of nowness, which you can't get, always too quick, always too slow. And pain, I would say, marks the line of this nowness. And it's also, pain, if you can talk about pain, is always too late because, then it has already entered your brain. But pain may be, in your finger or in your leg or somewhere else on your body. Or you can hear a tone which is out of your environment, and it even before it hits your ear, you can there is a kind of pain. But until you can understand that it's painful, it's already too late. So I would say there is an interesting possibility of equalizing, of bringing them together, affect and pain. And emotion and feelings are, I would say, a little bit different, because for feelings, even, we sometimes struggle and we say, I can't say specifically if I'm happy or not so much happy, but actually we have words and we have a cultural repertoire to which we can refer. But whereas with affect, we really don't know how to exactly define it. I know this is there's a huge repertoire of different affect theory, but I make a pretty strict distinction between affect and emotion, where because the affect is something which has more to do, or is more, not only, but more on the side of the body, whereas emotion is a kind of cultural repertoire. So I would say, the line between openness and closeness is, with affect and pain very well marked.
And
but may I just add something, because when you asked the second question to Janine, and I just thought about the coincidence that the book Future Bodies, which I did together with Zoe Sofolis 20 years ago, and today I'm again back with Zoe Sofolis and other colleagues from Australia and other countries about container technologies. And actually, I could have also talked about container technologies as a kind of, how to call it, as a kind of new image of bodily sculptures. That we are I mean, we are sort of wrapped into containers, technical containers, smart containers, and Zoe, when she wrote her paper, and it was a fantastic paper, and all of my students are reading it again. Because, when she wrote it in 2000, she said, we have to rethink psychoanalytical approaches, and we have, to bring the technical into our vision and to redefine subjectivation, processes of subjectivation. And by this, even, to rethink what is subjectivity and what is, the subject and the object. So this was the first thing when she said, we are surrounded by technical objects, but these technical objects actually are containers containing our bodies. And today we are rethinking. At the moment, we are discussing and rethinking, how to, against the background of the pandemic experience, where we have the experience of being contained in a very, very dramatic way, I would say.
Thank you for that. Yeah. The question of subjectivity brings me back to Julia Scher and her surveillance installations, and a question for you, Janine, because I was wondering, what role does gender play in a society of surveillance and control? And sometimes it even seems to me that observation is made by and for men. And I'm also thinking here of the construct of the male gaze. But how does Julia Scher play with this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Just like on the note of Julia, I did get a text from her being like, not just boundaries, walking to the edge of capture in one work to face the virtual while still in the physical. So yeah, something to put a pin in to come back to later. Thank you, Julia. I think on that idea of being on like the edge of capture while facing the virtual, while also being located in the virtual. So like thinking of like that virtuality and the physicality at the edge of capture, I think is like a really interesting sort of threshold that a spectator is situated in. And I think to your question, Francesca, on gender, I think I'll just say for myself, like I think I'm pretty informed by certain ideas like of the gaze, not also being like necessarily rooted in men, right? Like people identifying or sort of identified by the state or society as men, but in a sort of idea of masculinism, which people like Rosalind Deutsch have argued for as like a position that could be inhabited by women, by non-binary people. You could have like a masculinist position of gazing that is an authoritarian one, that's an all-encompassing one, that's a controlling one. And so that is actually not necessarily gendered, although there is obviously like a history of sort of like violent gazes on the part of men to women, but it's also to like recognize that like, women can also sometimes put themselves or be thrown into those positions, right, of like a sort of violent, dominating, authoritarian, controlling gaze. That's totally possible. And so I think one thing that's interesting to me when you ask that question is that like by the mid-80s, you have people like Jacqueline Rose, Sexuality in the Field of Vision, making a kind of that argument already in the Differences catalog for the new museum. At the same time, I do think that that is the case for Julia, that like even though there are so many signifiers in the cultural repertoire that Francesca describes, right, like of femininity, the pinkness, like the older women guards, she so often creates like a sort of female figure of that is not only being subject to surveillance, but who's doing the surveilling, right? And so I think that's like an important dynamic of gender play in the work, that a lot of like the roles are actually flipped in that to also sort of point. She uses these signifiers of like old age, debility, old women, a lot of those tropes that Jo Applin described so beautifully yesterday, to actually like help you sort of like rethink the guard as an omniscient figure, to actually make you see the vulnerable in that, the vulnerability of that apparatus of capture, but to also recognize that that apparatus captured, while gendered, is not only restricted to men necessarily. At the same time, I think gender is also complicated because like her work is so queer, right? It also comes out of like a really queer BDSM community, work in AIDS activism in New York, feminist, sort of work with Paper Tiger Television, in which so often in a sort of scene situation, traditional roles of dominance and violence and submission, are also like reworked and controlled to the volition of the participants. So I think the sort of like field of play in which gender happens and in which violence, psychic, interpersonal, and sexual gets renegotiated is how I would think about some of like the gendering processes of her work. And also like I think it was also super interesting to me to like listen to Marie-Louise's talk, and to recall these sort of like sometimes very utopian fantasies, right? Like of leaving the body, some of the transhumanist impulses, right? That you were charting for us. And I couldn't help but also think, of like some of like the violence that happened with that utopianism at the same time that maybe we can also talk about, because with Julia in her case, it's like, cyber dungeons, cyberspace was initially, imagined to be this free space of like play. You could adopt any race, you could adopt any gender. That those very ideas, when it comes to race, are quite violent ones, actually, because then you'd have cyber versions of blackface happening all over the internet. And Madame J's dungeon also had to deal with sexual assault. So there's an interesting like negotiation of like violence that moves across, sort of away from keyboard into online space and back and forth as these fantasies are also being argued for by artists and theorists, but also challenged by artists and theorists at the same time. And I was just sort of hearing the sort of tension between like those aspirations, but also the pushbacks happening in Marie-Louise's talk, which, I would also love to discuss later on if we get a chance.
And maybe that leads to my final question. I would like to ask Marie-Louise Angerer before I would like to invite our other participants to the symposium to join the round. So Wolfie, it would be great if you could show me our other speakers via Zoom so that I can see if then they want to ask some questions. So Marie-Louise, and with the things Janine said already in mind, especially with regard to your recent publication, and because Marta Dziwanska already mentioned this yesterday in her lecture on female avant-garde in a way, how important was feminist speculation in the 1980s and 90s, and how important is it especially in the present day for us?
I think, that until the 90s, until Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, there was a very, very high importance in feminist theory connected or referring to psychoanalytical theory. The gaze theory of the gaze, male and feminine and female as being an image or being in the position of an image was very famous in art and in film theory. And with the 90s, there was really this break. I mean, not a break, not in one moment, but over the first years in the 90s, performative turn, the effect turn, the pictorial turn, and then the new material turn. There was a very, very strong rejection of psychoanalytical turns, and means that the surface has become more important. Relations of the body to its environments, and queerness, as Janine just mentioned it. But queerness and very often, today, I'm confronted with examples, with images, with theoretical approaches belonging to new materialism, where they would like, or people asking questions of power, people of hierarchy, or whatsoever. And sometimes I think there is something missing. There is a theoretical hole. There is a theoretical black hole, because questions of power, questions of hierarchy, the questions of gender, the questions of queer, the questions of sexuality are so deeply rooted with our fantasy, with our imaginary. So very often, if this dimension is just omissed, then there is really something missing. So I think, what we are facing today is a kind of, I wouldn't like to say returning to the phantasmatic dimension, but as with Haraway, she has never been, even, she was very, very clear that she was not interested in psychoanalytical theory at all. But she was very clear, that the troubles she, asked us to stay with are not only, physical or political troubles, but always troubles, with are very complex and with troubles we can tell with stories. So, her semi or, science fiction or her figurations, one of her famous notions, is always, a very complex thing. And very often I think today that there is a kind of naive or kind of simplistic reading of many things. So that's my point of view.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to invite the other participants to raise their hands again, like physical, so I can see if you have questions. And then no questions? Okay. Maybe I ask Antti Krause-Waalert first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you very much to both of you. That was really great and inspiring. I love Annihilation, I have to say, especially the iridescent sphere where they have to enter. But I have a question to Janine. You mentioned that Sue studied architecture, and I was wondering if you know more about the role of sometimes difficult architectural design processes in or for his sculptures, because I think that especially in the 1970s, topological architecture, like Peter Eisenman did, were very important, and geometric bodies were thought as formable because computer technologies come into this field. And then there was a new understanding of space and form and architecture. And I'd just like to know if you know if there are connections and if this is a line which is important for the shapes or forms of his sculptures.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question and perception. And I should say that I don't know that much about architectural theory or design processes. So I'm not the best positioned person to be able to answer that. But I don't know if Tishan is also hanging out in the YouTube and also wants to Telegram or WhatsApp or text me a real answer to that question. But if you do, please go for it. I'm also happy to put you both in touch later on. I do think in terms of rendering and topography, architecture was really influential and important for Tishan. But so I think some of the precise aspects that you're asking for, I unfortunately don't exactly know. But it's a really great observation.
And I think Patricia also raised her hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these really two fantastic talks. I'm really, really happy to see them and hear them together. It was quite a beautiful rendering of a period that I think is very difficult because it's really about to be historicized. And that's maybe something I want to ask you about, in the sense that as you, Janine, have mentioned, Tish and Sue grew up in a period when figures like Eva Hesse, like Linda Benglis, were being looked at again, Louise Bourgeois. And I have a feeling that something similar is happening right now with these figures of the 80s, such as Tish and Sue, such as Julia Scher. And interestingly, we are in a moment where those figures that were super prominent in the 90s, such as Orlan and Stella, who really dominated this reading of the body, in a very literal way, if you will, are now being replaced with figures that work more through a conceptual framework rather than through the literal illustration of the expansion of the body that was happening at the time. And so it's between a comment and a question, but how you would describe this moment in terms of historicizing the 80s and 90s. Janine, that was for you.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Happy to. I think a couple of things. Just personally, I'm aware of younger artists who are really inspired by Tishan's work. People like Jay Fan, for instance, who shows with the MT Gallery in Hong Kong, and who has an upcoming solo show at the Kitchen that will be curated by Luni Tan, and I think like a lot of the sort of like organic forms, but also sort of like electronic aspects of the work, are really influential for Jay. And I think for artists like, Zach Blass, Julia Scher is like a very obvious predecessor in terms of like combining, the sort of like power dynamics of BDSM play as they relate to the sort of surveillance and control, sort of like organizations of power. So I definitely think like it's not a mistake, that, so many people are looking back at their work right now because there are a lot of younger generation artists who are trying to work in a similar vein and also looking for ancestors, looking for predecessors, right? That you can have like a sort of really pulpy, kinky, queer surveillance-based work, for Zach, or that you can be an Asian or Asian American person working in abstract form and technology and be recognized for that and have a discourse around that and be theoretically interested. I think something I didn't really mention is that like in the 2000s, Tishan also became really Deleuzian in a lot of his thinking and framework after teaching at Sarah Lawrence, and attending seminars taught on Deleuze by Una Chung, who, has worked a lot on post-colonial affect. So you actually see, some early sort of interests of his work that was sort of held apart a little bit coming together into the 2000s. So I definitely think like there's an aspect for me of looking back at that work, of like finding like sort of like elder figures. I think that younger artists are actively in dialogue with in terms of their work, but sometimes like, Jay and Tishan know each other. They're also like in active interlocution. But in terms of like, I think there's a larger historiographic question of like what version of the 80s and 90s are we actually also proposing when we do, the work of recovery, and I just think that right now there's a lot of really interesting art history that's reassessing the 80s and 90s and object-based work. I think one example that really stands out to me, is Huey Copeland's Bound to Appear of like rethinking the relationship of like sculptural object-based installations. At a high point of multiculturalism in the 1990s, when Black artists also started actually returning to discourses of slavery at that point of like immense racial representation and recognition. And I think that sort of like tension between like the time that one looks at and the time of its reception is something that I also feel historiographically animates the work we do. Something that I was just thinking about with Marie Louise's talk is that we both sort of ended on the temporality of the future perfect, and if like so much of postmodern work from the 1980s was talked about in terms of, say, space-time compression. We're also, like, in historicizing that work, actually using a historiographic sort of trope of our time, right? Like the future perfect time, which, was really interesting to hear your version of it. There's so many versions of future perfect, I think, circulating now in contemporary art. But for me, I think one of those things that draws me to that temporality is like the unfinished character of forms of surveillance and control that actually come out of a much longer modern project. So even though, disciplines, is reshaped by control, prisons don't go away. Actually they expand, in the last 30 years. And I don't think it's also a mistake that people are also turning towards how bodies feel and are architecturally and spatially enclosed in that moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Something to...
Sure. Yes.
Only very, very briefly, because, this is a really interesting question. And I think, that what we are facing today is a very different kind of storytelling. And not, the thing with Stellac and with Hollande, why it seems, very old-fashioned. I mean, old-fashioned in this is a very bad word for it, but it's a kind of, this naive taking up the body. Even with Hollande, it was very, very theoretically elaborated, with her references to Lacan and so on. But even so, I think it was still, a kind of, making a theory visible, or in Stellac, saying, we're just expanding the body. Even, it was sometimes very painful and hurting, but it was kind of a naive one-to-one. But today, I think, it's a very, very, these storytelling moments, these kind of, how to relate to something, and this re-questioning. Also, the temporality, Janine, you've just mentioned, is kind of, towards and back, this kind of past and present and future. These kind of, things, of course, they are technically introduced, but even so, they have a very important influence, on outside technically moments, or outside, a technical dimension.
Can I also just add one more thing in response to Marie, or should I? Is that okay?
Yes.
I just wanted to say, the model of your using both psychoanalysis and affect theory together in the same paper, in the way that you did, Marie-Louise, because something that also comes up for me is looking back at the 80s and 90s, so many artists and discourse were in different camps, right? It was an age where people would still have polemics of these forms of adversarial division. And the people that we're talking about were talked about in really different camps in terms of Julia and Tishon, and then Stellac and bio art. And there's a whole kind of sort of realm of electronic and bio art that was outside of the purview of the people who were doing these kinds of postmodernisms of resistance around photo and video work, and I think there's something interesting about this moment where these kinds of extremely hard divisions don't hold as much for younger artists, and your point around some of the limits of a sort of really sort of free floating, not always ideal representation of, Deleuze and Guattari, missing out the sort of apparatus theory, that would think about politics and knowledge, and control and discipline, and I think there's, I appreciate in your methodology, trying to think different theoretical bodies of work together, different artistic bodies of work together, because even though those divisions existed historically, we get to make choices in the present of how we can acknowledge them, but also not necessarily hew to all the sort of spaces of their cleavages.
So thank you. And we also have a few comments and questions in our virtual chat, and one or two of which I would like to pass on to you, and especially to Janine. I read to Janine. The use of wires in both Sue's and Cher's work seems significant. For sure, it's a shift from early aesthetics of video, and for Sue, they are so distinct from earlier sculptures' wires, like in Keith Saunier. Do you have any thoughts into the sculptural use of wires in both Sue and Cher?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to try to answer this briefly, although that's a really good formal point. I think for Sue, a lot of the wires are there to connect the body to some kind of apparatus that is actually ideally keeping it alive or imaging it, So you have a sort of wall work that's hooked up to a drip or something, or the wires, they're cables that connect different parts of the sculpture as though one is subsisting on the other, as though on life support, so it's a sort of very biomedical kind of language in which the cables and wires are used very specifically as connectors. For Julia, I think a lot of the wires, some of them are it's the apparatus that's on display, right? So there's a kind of structuralism also of, of experimental cinema that's there. You're going to show the apparatus as well as showing the image and the object and the cinema setting. You're going to show the apparatus. At the same time, there's a lot of things that are not actually hooked up to anything, and sometimes, I think people like Lynn Tillman and have talked about like the way she like paints or sculpts like across space, you know, and sometimes they're really there to just like complete a composition. But I think this is interesting in a surveillance context where like I think Trump Loyal tends to get very degraded in modernist and postmodernist art history. But in a surveillance context, I think it's actually really interesting because people actually often adjust their behaviors based on the perception of something recording them, whether or not that thing is actually even hooked up, you know. And so there's like a training of the self that happens the minute like these kinds of wires or rigging are even available to view, that I think produces a kind of like surveillance pedagogy through these kinds of like fake wires that are ostensibly there in a very pictorial, illusionistic sense.
Maybe there are a lot of more questions and also some comments, but I think because it's already like time to say bye soon, I would end this discussion now, and maybe, yeah, I think we store the questions and we can discuss about them later, or yeah, maybe you can write them or answer them in the chat. So thank you so much for the interesting and intense discussion. We are already over time, and this panel passed so quickly, and I just wanted to warmly thank especially Janine and Marie-Louise Angerer again for your fabulous and very exciting contributions, and a big thanks to all of you for having been with us and discussing with us. And just a quick announcement and reminder, the next online event of the symposium will take place in just a few minutes at 6:45, so 6:45 p.m. Central European Time, so in 5 minutes. And Louise Today-Soki will share with us an intermezzo talk on the desire of objects, slavery, and the sex life of machines. And I think that will be very interesting also afterwards our panel. And you'd have to do, and all you have to do is change the live stream. So we will provide the new link for the new live stream to Louis' talk in the chat of this event. And of course, we would be happy to welcome you there again in a few moments. And yes, thank you to everyone. This was great.
Thank you.